The Revolution Betrayed by Leon Trotsky. Chapter 7. Family, Youth, and Culture. Number 2. The Struggle Against the Youth. Every revolutionary party finds its chief support in the younger generation of the rising class. Political decay expresses itself in a loss of ability to attract the youth under one's banner. The parties of bourgeois democracy, in withdrawing one after another from the scene, are compelled to turn over the young either to revolution or fascism. Bolshevism, when underground, was always a party of young workers. The Mensheviks relied upon the more respectable, skilled upper stratum of the working class, always prided themselves on it, and looked down on the Bolsheviks. Subsequent events harshly showed them their mistake. At the decisive moment, the youth carried with them the more mature stratum, and even the old folks. The revolution gave a mighty historical impulse to the new Soviet generation. It cut them free at one blow from conservative forms of life, and exposed to them the great secret. The first secret of the dialectic, that there is nothing unchanging on this earth, and that society is made out of plastic materials. How stupid is the theory of unchanging racial types in the light of the events of our epoch. The Soviet Union is an immense melting pot in which the characters of dozens of nationalities are being mixed. The mysticism of the Slavic soul is coming off like scum. But the impulse given to the younger generation has not yet found expression in corresponding historic enterprise. To be sure, the youth are very active in the sphere of economics. In the Soviet Union, there are 7 million workers under 23, 3,140,000 in industry, 700,000 in the railroads, 700,000 in the building trades. In the new giant factories, about half the workers are young. There are now 1,200,000 communist youth in the collective farms. Hundreds of thousands of members of the communist youth have been mobilized during recent years for construction work, timber work, coal mining, gold production, for work in the Arctic, Sakhalin, or in Amur, where the new town of Komsomolsk is in the process of construction. The new generation is putting out shock brigades, champion workers, stakhanovists, foremen, under-administrators. The youth are studying, and a considerable part of them are studying assiduously. They are as active, if not more so, in the sphere of athletics in its most daring or warlike forms, such as parachute jumping and marksmanship. The enterprising and audacious are going on all kinds of dangerous expeditions. The better part of our youth, said recently the well-known polar explorer Schmidt, are eager to work where difficulties await them. This is undoubtedly true, but in all spheres, the post-revolutionary generation is still under guardianship. They are told from above what to do and how to do it. Politics, as the highest form of command, remains wholly in the hands of the so-called old guard. And in all the ardent and frequently flattering speeches they address to the youth, the old boys are vigilantly defending their own monopoly. Not conceiving of the development of a socialist society without the dying away of the state, that is, without the replacement of all kinds of police oppression by the self-administration of educated producers and consumers, Engels laid tile accomplishments of this task upon the younger generation. Who will grow up in new, free social conditions, and will be in a position to cast away all this rubbish of statism? Lenin adds on his part, every kind of statism, the democratic republican included. The prospect of the construction of a socialist society stood, then, in the mind of Engels and Lenin, approximately thus. The generation which conquered the power, the old guard, will begin the work of liquidating the state. The next generation will complete it. How do things stand in reality? 43% of the population of the Soviet Union were born after the October Revolution. If you take the age of 23 as the boundary between the two generations, then over 50% of Soviet humanity has not yet reached this boundary. A big half of the population of the country, consequently, knows nothing by personal recollection of any regime except that of the Soviets. But it is just this new generation which is forming itself not in free social conditions, as Engels conceived it, but under intolerable and constantly increasing oppression from the ruling stratum, composed of the same old who, according to the official fiction, achieved the Great Revolution. In the factory, the collective farm, the barracks, the university, the schoolroom, even in the kindergarten, if not in the creche, the chief glory of man is declared to be personal loyalty to the leader and unconditional obedience. Many pedagogical aphorisms and maxims of recent times might seem to have been copied from Goebbels, if he himself had not copied them in good part from the collaborators of Stalin. The school and the social life of the student are saturated with formalism and hypocrisy. The children have learned to sit through innumerable deadly dull meetings with their inevitable honorary presidium, their chants in honor of the dear leaders, their prestiged, righteous debates in which, quite in the manner of their elders, they say one thing and think another. The most innocent groups of school children, who try to create oases in this desert of officiousness, are met with fierce measures of repression. Through its agentry, the GPU introduces the sickening corruption of treachery and tale-bearing into the so-called socialist schools. The more thoughtful teachers and children's writers, in spite of the enforced optimism, cannot always conceal their horror in the presence of this spirit of repression, falsity, and boredom which is killing school life. Having no experience of class struggle and revolution, the new generations could have ripened for independent participation in the social life of the country only in conditions of Soviet democracy, only by consciously working over the experience of the past and the lessons of the present. Independent character, like independent thought, cannot develop without criticism. The Soviet youth, however, are simply denied the elementary opportunity to exchange thoughts, make mistakes, and try out and correct mistakes, their own as well as others. All questions, including their very own, are decided for them. Theirs only to carry out the decision and sing the glory of those who made it. To every word of criticism, the bureaucracy answers with a twist of the neck. All who are outstanding and unsubmissive in the ranks of the young are systematically destroyed, suppressed, or physically exterminated. This explains the fact that out of the millions upon millions of communist youth, there has not emerged a single big figure. In throwing themselves into engineering, science, literature, sport, or chess playing, the youth are, so to speak, winning their spurs for future great action. In all these spheres, they compete with the badly prepared older generation, and often equal and best them. But at every contact with politics, they burn their fingers. They have, thus, but three possibilities open to them: participate in the bureaucracy and make a career, submit silently to oppression, retire into economic work, science, or their own petty personal affairs, or, finally, go underground and learn to struggle and temper their character for the future. The road of the bureaucratic career is accessible only to a small minority. At the other pole, a small minority enter the ranks of the opposition. The middle group, the overwhelming mass, is in turn very heterogeneous, but in it, under the iron press, extremely significant although hidden processes are at work, which will, to a great extent, determine the future of the Soviet Union. The ascetic tendencies of the epoch of the Civil War gave way in the period of the NEP to a more Epicurean, not to say avid, mood. The first 5-year plan again became a time of involuntary asceticism, but now only for the masses and the youth. The ruling stratum had firmly dug themselves in positions of personal prosperity. The second 5-year plan is undoubtedly accompanied by a sharp reaction against asceticism. A concern for personal advancement has seized upon broad circles of the population, especially the young. The fact is, however, that in the new Soviet generation, well-being and prosperity are accessible only to that thin layer who manage to rise above the mass and one way or another accommodate themselves to the ruling stratum. The bureaucracy on its side is consciously developing and sorting out machine politicians and careerists. said the chief speaker at a Congress of the Communist Youth in April 1936. Greed for profits, Philistine pettiness, and base egotism are not the attributes of Soviet youth. These words sound sharply discordant with the reigning slogans of a prosperous and handsome life, with the methods of piecework, premiums, and decorations. Socialism is not ascetic. On the contrary, it is deeply hostile to the asceticism of Christianity. It is deeply hostile in its adherence to this world, and this only, to all religion. But socialism has its gradations of earthly values. Human personality begins for socialism not with the concern for a prosperous life, but on the contrary, with the cessation of this concern. However, no generation can jump over its own head. The whole Stakhanov movement is for the present built upon base egotism. The very measures of success, the number of trousers and neckties earned, testifies to nothing but Philistine pettiness. Suppose that this historic stage is unavoidable. All right. It is still necessary to see it as it is. The restoration of market relations opens an indubitable opportunity for a considerable rise of personal prosperity. The broad trend of the Soviet youth toward the engineering profession is explained not so much by the allurements of socialist construction as by the fact that engineers earn incomparably more than physicians or teachers. When such tendencies arise in circumstances of intellectual oppression and ideological reaction, and with a conscious unleashing from above of careerist instincts, then the propagation of what is called socialist culture often turns out to be education in the spirit of the most extreme antisocial egotism. Still, it would be a crude slander against the youth to portray them as controlled exclusively or even predominantly by personal interests. No, in the general mass, they are magnanimous, responsive, enterprising. Careerism colors them only from above. In their depths are various unformulated tendencies, grounded in heroism, and still only awaiting application. It is upon these moods in particular that the newest kind of Soviet patriotism is nourishing itself. It is undoubtedly very deep, sincere, and dynamic. But in this patriotism, too, there is a rift which separates the young from the old. Healthy young lungs find it intolerable to breathe in the atmosphere of hypocrisy, inseparable from a thermidor, from a reaction, that is, which is still compelled to dress in the garments of revolution. The crying discord between the socialist posters and the reality of life undermines faith in the official canons. A considerable stratum of the youth takes pride in its contempt for politics, in rudeness and debauch. In many cases, and probably a majority, this indifferentism and cynicism is but the initial form of discontent and of a hidden desire to stand up on one's own feet. The expulsion from the communist youth and the party, the arrest and exile of hundreds of thousands of young white guards and opportunists on the one hand and Bolshevik-Leninists on the other, proves that the wellsprings of conscious political opposition, both right and left, are not exhausted. On the contrary, during the last couple of years they have been bubbling with renewed strength. Finally, the more impatient, hot-blooded, unbalanced, injured in their interests and feelings, are turning their thoughts in the direction of terrorist revenge. Such approximately is the spectrum of the political moods of the Soviet youth. The history of individual terror in the Soviet Union clearly marks the stages in the general evolution of the country. At the dawn of the Soviet power, in the atmosphere of the still unfinished Civil War, terrorist deeds were perpetrated by white guards or social revolutionaries. When the former ruling classes lost hope of a restoration, terrorism also disappeared. The Kulak terror, echoes of which have been observed up to very recent times, had always a local character and supplemented the guerrilla warfare against the Soviet regime. As for the latest outburst of terrorism, it does not rest either upon the old ruling classes or upon the Kulak. The terrorists of the latest draft are recruited exclusively from among the young, from the ranks of the communist youth and the party, not infrequently from the offspring of the ruling stratum. Although completely impotent to solve the problems which it sets itself, this individual terror has nevertheless an extremely important symptomatic significance. It characterizes the sharp contradiction between the bureaucracy and the broad masses of the people, especially the young. All taken together, economic hazards, parachute jumping, polar expeditions, demonstrative indifferentism, romantic hooligans, terroristic mood, and individual acts of terror are preparing an explosion of the younger generation against the intolerable tutelage of the old. A war would undoubtedly serve as a vent for the accumulating vapors of discontent, but not for long. In a war, the youth would soon acquire the necessary fighting temper and the authority which it now so sadly lacks. At the same time, the reputation of the majority of old men would suffer irremediable damage. At best, a war would give the bureaucracy only a certain moratorium. The ensuing political conflict would be so much the more sharp. It would be one-sided, of course, to reduce the basic political problem of the Soviet Union to the problem of the two generations. There are many open and hidden foes of the bureaucracy among the old, just as there are hundreds of thousands of perfected yes-men from among the young. Nevertheless, from whatever side the attack came against the position of the ruling stratum, from left or right, the attackers would recruit their chief forces among the oppressed and discontented youth deprived of political rights. The bureaucracy admirably understands this. It is in general exquisitely sensitive to everything which threatens its dominant position. Naturally, in trying to consolidate its position in advance, it erects the chief trenches and concrete fortifications against the younger generation. In April 1936, as we have said, there assembled in the Kremlin the 10th Congress of the Communist Youth. Nobody bothered to exclaim, of course, why, in violation of its constitution, the Congress had not been called for an entire 5 years. Moreover, it soon became clear that this carefully sifted and selected Congress was called at this time exclusively for the purpose of a political expropriation of the youth. According to the new constitution, the Communist Youth League is now even judicially deprived of the right to participate in the social life of the country. Its sole sphere henceforth is to be education and cultural training. The General Secretary of the Communist Youth, under orders from above, declared in his speech, "We must end the chatter about industrial and financial planning, about the lowering of production costs, economic accounting, crop sowing, and other important state problems, as though we were going to decide them." The whole country might well repeat those last words, as though we were going to decide them. That insolent rebuke, "End the chatter," welcomed with anything but enthusiasm, even by this super-submissive Congress, is the more striking when you remember that the Soviet law defines the age of political majority as 18 years, giving all electoral rights to young men and women of that age, whereas the age limit for communist youth members, according to the old constitution, was 23 years, and a good third of the members of the organization were in reality older than that. This last Congress adopted two simultaneous reforms. It legalized membership in the communist youth for people of greater age, thus increasing the number of communist youth electors, and at the same time deprived the organization as a whole of the right to intrude into the sphere not only of general politics, of that there can never be any question, but of the current problems of economy. The abolition of the former age limit was dictated by the fact that transfer from the communist youth into the party, formerly an almost automatic process, has now been made extremely difficult. This annulment of the last remnant of political rights, and even of the appearance of them, was caused by a desire fully and finally to enslave the communist youth to the well-purged party. Both measures, obviously contradicting each other, derived nevertheless from the same source, the bureaucracy's fear of the younger generation. The speakers of the Congress, who according to their own statements were carrying out the express instructions of Stalin, they gave these warnings in order to forestall in advance the very possibility of a debate, explained the aim of the reform with astonishing frankness. "We have no need of any second party." This argument reveals the fact that in the opinion of the ruling circles of the Communist Youth League, if it is not decisively strangled, threatens to become a second party. As though on purpose to define these possible tendencies, another speaker warningly declared, "In his time, no other than Trotsky himself attempted to make a demagogic play for the youth, to inspire it with the anti-Leninist, anti-Bolshevik idea of creating a second party, etc." The speaker's historic allusion contains an anachronism. In reality, Trotsky, in his time, only gave warning that a further bureaucratization of the regime would inevitably lead to a break with the youth, and produce the danger of a second party. But never mind, the course of events, in confirming that warning, has converted it ipso facto into a program. The degenerating party has kept its attractive power only for careerists. Honest and thinking young men and girls cannot but be nauseated by Byzantine slavishness, the false rhetoric, concealing privilege and caprice, the braggadocio of mediocre bureaucrats singing praises to each other, at all these marshals who, because they can't catch the stars in heaven, have to stick them on their own bodies in various places. Thus, it is no longer a question of the danger, as it was 12 or 13 years ago, of a second party, but of its historic necessity as the sole power capable of further advancing the cause of the October Revolution. The change in the constitution of the Communist Youth League, although reinforced with fresh police threats, will not, of course, halt the political maturing of the youth, and will not prevent their hostile clash with the bureaucracy. Which way will the youth turn in case of a great political disturbance? Under what banner will they assemble their ranks? Nobody can give a sure answer to that question now, least of all the youth themselves. Contradictory tendencies are furrowing their minds. In the last analysis, the alignment of the principal mass will be determined by historic events of world significance, by a war, by new successes of fascism, or, on the contrary, by the victory of the proletarian revolution in the West. In any case, the bureaucracy will find out that these youth, deprived of rights, represent a historic charge with mighty explosive power. In 1894, the Russian autocracy, through the lips of the young Tsar Nicholas II, answered the Zemstvos, which were timidly dreaming of participating in political life, with the famous words, "meaningless fancies." In 1936, the Soviet bureaucracy answered the as yet vague claims of the younger generation with the still ruder cry, "Stop your chatter." Those words, too, will become historic. The regime of Stalin may pay no less dear for them than the regime headed by Nicholas II.